Hello and welcome back to the Neurodivergent Connection, formerly known as Inside the Asperger Studios. Before he was a national disability advocate, before speaking on stages and writing books, he was a father learning alongside his son. Today's conversation is about faith, disability, and what 20 years in education teaches you that no textbook ever could. So sit back, relax, and grab your favorite beverage, and I'll see you on the other side. See you there, everybody.
I wanna believe in the truth, but only see what I'm shown. Got the freedom to choose, but can't decide on my own. Follow what the group is thinking, bottle up my intuition till it's popping up.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Neurodivergent Connection, once called Inside the Asperger Studios. Today I'm joined with John Fella. Welcome to the show, John.
Absolutely. Thanks, Reed. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So why don't we start off with something I usually ask all my guests is why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and we'll get going from there.
Absolutely. I always like to start these interviews by jokingly saying that I refer to myself as the Swiss Army knife of disability advocacy because I do a little bit of everything. I of course, start out first of all by saying that I am a parent of disability. I have a 17-year-old son, soon to be 18, actually, in a couple of days. His name is Chris. He is autistic and also nonverbal. Chris actually currently resides at a autism school and residential facility in Wichita, Kansas, where he's just finishing up high school and eventually will come home. But Chris is really my motivation for doing all of the work that I've done over the years. He's really inspired and motivated me. I actually spent many years as an educator, working in mostly elementary grades, some preschool. I was a school director for a time and also a special ed teacher. I started advocacy work, though, probably about 10-ish years ago, just feeling the need, one, to kind of want to give back and share my story and experience and also to help resource myself as well. And it started out in small ways in terms of, doing like meetups for special needs dads in my area here in the Chicago area, which I'm actually still a part of and still running. But then working with larger organizations, disability related organizations and ministries around the country, doing writing and speaking for them at conferences, podcasts like this, videos, etc. I'm also proud to say I'll soon be a published author. I have two books coming out. One is my book, which is essentially my memoir of being a special needs dad. That'll be out in February. And then I have another book that it's actually a friend that's doing a book with Temple Grandin, and I'm
Oh,
contributing to that book. And that book is actually going to be geared for educators as well as therapists to kind of give them a first person perspective on what it is to either identify as a person with a disability or be a parent. So very excited about that. And yeah, just always glad
mm.
to share my message.
It's nice to meet a fellow author. I just finished my book and my editor just finished it. I submitted it to five different publishers. Everyone's telling me or making sure I submitted it to Jessica Kingsley because they're the ones that specialize in their divergent stories. So it's with them. So I'm waiting. My book, like yours, is a memoir, actually. But what I did is I kind of flipped it upside down. I didn't make it poor me, why me, and this is how it ends. I basically my book follows my life, but with the message of the very important message of, and I'm sure you know this, is you need to step out of your comfort zone.
Yes, yes, you do. And I know for me, one of the things that I learned, and I learned this the hard way many years ago, was the need for intentional community, for
Yeah,
intentional support. It's one thing when you're on this journey to have family and friends, and that's great. But if people cannot relate to your experience, you at
it's tough.
least need one or two or three people that
Mhm.
kind of get it. And not that anybody's ever going to completely get it, but folks that can relate to things on some deeper levels. So for me, that was something that I learned very quickly, 15 years ago. Wow, I don't have any support. I have some folks who care about me, but they
Yeah,
don't know how to help me. So
yeah,
how do I do that? How do I look for it? But also, how can I create it where it doesn't
yeah.
exist?
I mean, one of the things I've learned in talking with a lot of experts in things is parents don't realize just because you got your kids situated and set up doesn't mean you're done. Your mission just started, and now you got to take care of yourself. And I know there are people out. I've had a couple of people that do that. They go to the next step with the parents, like now, and they're like, parents don't realize their story just started. Now they got to figure out how to manage themselves, how to make sure they don't get into a crisis with their own mental health.
Right, right, exactly, and that's something that unfortunately, and yeah, I really like to put a laser focus kind of a lens on dads specifically,
Hmm.
because what you also find is that there is a lot of support out there. Most parents, especially when their child is very young or a diagnosis is very new, they're just overwhelmed. They don't even know what they need or how to find it. But then what you see is, moms, and this was again very much my experience. Moms have a lot of support. My son's mom, who I'm actually divorced from, she always had support. She always had groups and things and social media and all that. And there's a lot of books as well, that are geared for that. Not as much for the dads,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there are resources, and I'm glad to be connected with them, but there aren't enough. And so it's just a matter of people really being able to acknowledge, yeah, you know what, this is something I need. And it doesn't mean you have to turn your world upside down, but you need to be at least vulnerable and willing to connect on some level.
Yeah, so let's start off with what moved you to support other special needs parents, especially dads? I mean, we talked about that there, you said there isn't enough support for the dads. Where do you feel the dads need more support?
So what I learned early on in my experience was the fact that as a man, as a father, as a husband, I processed my emotions, my grief, my frustration, whatever I was going through. I processed it, differently than say my son's mom would. Some of those things are similar, but not always the same. And the other thing too was that I noticed, for example, in my marriage to my son's mom, one of the things that typically happens in these marriages is that it's usually the mom who will jump in with managing everything, right? They
Hmm.
manage the doctors, they manage the appointments, they manage the insurance. And my son's mom did that, and she was great at it, and she still is, quite honestly. But here was the thing. Most men that I have either talked to or when I've talked to moms, and this is around the country, a lot of the guys, not all, but a lot of them, their knee-jerk response is, I'm going to throw myself into my work. I'm going to throw myself into my career. I'm going to make a lot of money so then we can throw the money at all these problems because men are fixers. Okay, great. Well, here's the problem. So, first of all, if you throw yourself into your work, no one's judging you for that. And obviously, you need to make money to cover these things. But the problem is that then you become emotionally cut off from the family, from your spouse, from your child. And that's where things like the guilt and the stress can weave in. And, there's animosity of, well, I work all the time, but, mom is handling all this, and each one is throwing things back at each other. But here was the unique wrinkle for me. I was never the breadwinner in our family,
Mm.
right? My wife, my son's mom was a teacher as well, but she always made more money. So, and again, being an educator, it's not like you're rolling in it anyway. So the fact is that I could never just write checks, blank checks for whatever. That was never who I was. So then the question became, who was I? Who was I in the marriage and the family? What do I do, right? What's my gift? And so through all of these experiences, I learned, well, I think I'm a people person. I'm a networker. I like to, engage with, folks and ask questions. So maybe this is a way that I can contribute because I can bring support in terms of resources, connections, networking, etc. And then, of course, that blossomed into my own advocacy work, which, to be quite honest, as much as I love helping people, and I always would, that it is also paid back to me because I have those resources now that I need for my own child, right? So, if I can help lift up someone else, that person or persons will probably lift me up at some point too. But, it really came down to me being, again, going back to that word vulnerable, to really say, hey, you know what? I need to find my place and I don't have it. What is my place? Now, again, just very briefly, I'll say that all of the advocacy work that I do, does not take away from me being a parent, right? I have to be a good parent first. I have to be a good husband. When I was married to my son's mom, now I'm remarried. So, my role in my family is the primary thing. Any of the other stuff I do, if I stopped it tomorrow, I'd be okay because I have to remember that I'm present in my son's life, and that's still my focus.
Now, when was the moment you realized you weren't alone and there were other dads that shouldn't be either?
Yeah, so it was a long process. So in my presentations that I give at like conferences and things, I tell a story called The Tale of Two Parking Lots. So and this really kind of encapsulates my argument for community and the importance of it. So back about 15 years ago, when I was married to my son's mom and my son was very young and his diagnosis was still pretty fresh, we went through a season of life where everything stopped working. Like you name it, it went wrong. I had a job loss. We were struggling financially. We almost lost our house. We couldn't figure out the right placement for our son as far as schooling. Our marriage was hanging like all of this, right? So we belonged to a church at the time, and they used to have a men's group, and the men's group would meet on Friday nights, and most of the guys in this group were older than me, like on average by like 20 years. And I remember that I sat in my car before I went into the meeting, and I'm in the middle of just this total life crisis. I called a couple of my oldest friends because I had some time, before I went into the meeting. And I told them what happened, and my friends are like, "Wow, man, that's tough. We're sorry to hear that. We don't know what to tell you." In fact, I had one of my friends actually say, "You know what? This sounds crazy to me. If I were you, I'd just walk away." And I'm like, "Well, I can't do that." So I go into this meeting and I'm thinking, okay, most of these guys are older than me. They're going to give me some wisdom and advice and da da da. And it's one of these things. Everybody kind of goes around the circle. Hey, how's it going? What's new? And they knew some of this, but not everything. So that was the night that I just kind of put it all out on the table. And after I was done sharing everything I was going through, the room was like stunned silent for about 30 seconds. And then the group leader chimed in and said, "Wow, that's really tough. We're sorry to hear that. But what you need to know is that it's going to be okay." Now, here's the problem. I didn't need to hear it was okay then. Yes, it was going to be okay eventually. That's true. I didn't need to hear that in that moment. I needed support. I needed someone to come around and say, "Hey, what can I do? Do you need to talk? Do you need to connect? Can we, go out for coffee or a meal or, anything?" Not, "Well, sorry to hear that. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it." I'm like, "No, I need something else." So I realized then that I didn't have real community. So how did I find it and build it? So for me, it was kind of multiple streams. First of all, and again, identifying it as a Christian and as a person of faith, we attended church for many years. We had to find a different church. We found a better church, actually one closer to where we eventually wound up moving with our son to get him in a better school district in the north suburbs. And, getting connected with men who were intentional with their lives, intentional about asking about you, sharing life, supporting, right? So I learned from those guys how to do that. And whether it's in a church or religious setting or not, the tools and the approaches, really apply to any situation in any environment, right? So learn by being around those guys who showed me what real community was, and then branching out to connecting with other dads of disability in my own neighborhood community, a lot of the families that, same school my son attended, and, we tried some different, meetup groups and different versions of that. The original ones didn't really stick, but it still allowed me to make some relationships with guys that knew exactly what I was going through. And then as I started to build and grow and develop things, we had other groups, other meetup groups. I got involved with some other bigger organizations that supported parents and dads and that type of thing. And so through a lot of these experiences, both on a very grassroots kind of a level, meaning guys just down the street from me, or guys that just wanted to meet up at a local restaurant or bar, or, that we went to church with, whatever, and then connecting with guys on a bigger scale, that really showed me what true community is. But the core of that community are those intentional, real relationships and friendships you make. Without that, because that's really that's the basis for it, but it's also the fruit. It's, when I look at my life and I say, yeah, it's been a crazy road, But one of the things I can be grateful for are the relationships and the friendships I've made, people I never would have met, ever. But because I was on this path, I got to meet and be friends with some really incredibly cool people.
Now, when you began writing motivational posts, what were you hoping other dads would feel or take away from your words?
So, I'd spent several years as a blogger for a bunch of different platforms, and most of my messages were really geared for parents in general. But for dads specifically, and there are a couple of articles that I've written where I tell stories that are very personal to me. But one of the things that our families really struggle with is the extremely high divorce rate, right? I'm not even gonna say it's a particular number because the numbers always change, but kind of the generic stat is that it's about 80%. 80% of families where there's a child of disability usually wind up divorced within 5 years of a diagnosis. Okay. So even if it's not 80%, it's still precipitously higher than the 50% average already that exists with just divorces in the country. So what you see is you have a lot of dads who, in some cases, unfortunately, literally walk away from their kids and their families. But in a lot of cases, it's something where, again, going back to what I described before, mom and dad just can't figure it out. And without real support or counseling or someone walking alongside them, it just
Mhm.
implodes. So really speaking to dads who have walked the road also in my case as well of divorce, of single parenting, and really that loneliness because I never wanted the divorce. My son's mom actually initiated it. It was something I was willing to work on. She wasn't, so okay, fine. We still get along great, but the fact is that there are men out there who I know, a lot of special needs dads are gonna actually be single parents or maybe remarried, but they know that struggle of the loneliness of as difficult as it is to raise your child with a disability, when you are a married couple, when you're a family unit, doing it by yourself is that much harder on so many levels. And I know that in some of my writing where I've spoken specifically to dads, and a lot of this also comes out in the book as well, because a lot of it is that journey of, what, I love my son, and as long as he's in my life, that's great. But man, is it that much more difficult when you're by yourself as a single parent without any support
Mhm.
from mom, dad, spouse, whatever. And then even just the loneliness you feel being on an island, because again, it's, on the one hand, you're parenting your child by yourself when you have your child, but then also to, you don't have that person right next to you to confide in, or, I mean, obviously you have friends and you have support and community. But not having your spouse, your partner with you, that's a whole other level of loneliness, especially when you walk this road as a special needs parent.
I mean, one of the things I've learned is, and I've heard stories and everything, is parents don't realize it. When you have find out your child becomes special needs, it's either a make or break moment for the couple. Because either they can handle it or it's too much stress on the relationship and then it's split. And for what you're doing for the fathers is something very beneficial because a lot of fathers that get put in this situation are like, where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah, yeah, and I know it's interesting because I know a lot of married dads of disability.
Mhm.
I know plenty of divorced ones, some who have moved on and either remarried or met someone kind of a thing, and some who haven't. But see that's where I think too, we really need to put a spotlight on the dads because there are so many good fathers out there. And yeah, divorce is just it just it's pervasive in our culture, whether there's disability or not. But my heart grieves for some of these guys when I see them, as much as is already on their plate, And now, you have that separation. And again, to be fair, there are dads who literally just walk away, but the majority of the ones, and especially the ones that I know and have met, don't. And especially even in my case, I was never going to stop being a great dad. But it's hard and it's lonely.
Oh yeah.
And this is where dads really need that connection the most. And that's why I would encourage guys because again, there are a lot of different ways to get support. Some guys don't want to be with a big group. That's fine. There are ways to get support one-on-one, and I've even said it, and I say it all the time publicly. I say, if you're a dad listening to this and you don't have anybody, heck, reach out to me. That's fine. Wherever you live, I don't know if you live close to me, great, we can connect or virtually or email or something, but like, don't do this alone. Don't do it alone. It's such a challenging road already with the diagnosis of disability. Don't do it alone just because you're, separated from, mom, spouse, whatever.
I mean, what a lot of people don't realize for you in the so-called manner is you have a extra additional problem. Well, not a problem, but challenge, I should say. It's one thing to raise a child who's autistic, who is verbal, but you throw on the challenge of nonverbal, it becomes even harder because now you got to think of a ways to communicate. How am I going to communicate to my child? How is he going to communicate to me? Yes, there's ACC and all that stuff and the touch type and all that, but you got to get to that point and you have to know about it. There are parents out there, single, married, who don't know that there are devices out there, but no one's telling them where to go. It's the whole fight and struggle of who do I talk to that can tell me where to go and get this stuff.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you bring that up because here's what I'll say. My son's mom and I, if there was something out there to try, right? If there was something that someone told us about, as long because now mind you, there's a lot of weird stuff out in left field and things,
Mhm.
but as long as it was a reasonable protocol approach, we tried it or at least looked at it. But here's the issue where I think our families are really vulnerable because I've certainly been to a lot of these disability conferences and autism conferences and this kind of thing. And you go to these information areas, right? And everybody is selling a product or a diet or a therapy, and everybody's got the solution. And here's what I say. It's kind of like if you think about it from the terms of like the music world, right? Okay, being a lover of music, every band or every artist out there, whoever they are, whenever they were around, whatever their hit was, everybody's like a number one fan of somebody, right? Even as obscure as it gets. In the same way, every treatment might work for one person,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean it's a cure-all. There is no magic bullet. So, and especially in this, language communication area. So, for example, my son has an iPad with the Touch Chat app, which
Mhm.
he has actually been pretty successful with. But again, it really depends on the person that's working within the structure. If I literally just hand him the iPad and tell me something, he's gonna swipe at the first thing and be like, "Come on, man, get this out of my face," kind of thing. Or he'll just keep hitting the button for food and that leads him to the next page with the French fries on it because that's his answer to everything. But but again, he has been able to communicate successfully using it again, given the right environment, right? As well as, we have tried things like I know there's like the Soma method and there's, almost as like facilitated communication kind of a thing. And again, it's some of those things can be successful, but again, it's just this idea that, oh, okay, some kids are great with walking around with a letter board. Some kids like my son are just going to throw it aside. Some kids work more with some of these more structured approaches, and some maybe are just better typing things on the screen, whatever. Again, I have seen some kids be very successful with typing through an app on a device type of a thing, and being able to communicate not just phrases and sentences, but even writing out short stories as well, or poems, that type of thing. But my main point here is that there is no one size fits all. So you have to do what's best for your child. In my son's case, it's a combination of his touch chat. It's a combination of body language, cueing, some basic signs. It's a little sprinkle of everything. But again, I know, and my son's mom knows that journey, that road of, man, okay, this is how you do it. You have to do it this way. You have to have, a letter board in every room. You have to make him sit down, make him point, do this, do that. And here's the thing, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. Now, as a parent, do I want to support my child? Absolutely.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you also need to know your limits, your boundaries.
Mhm.
And if your child doesn't respond to a certain approach, well, then maybe just back off it and okay, maybe we'll try something different or we'll come back to this, right? But it can also be a stressor, right? Just like with other behavioral therapies or ABA or different approaches to things. And again, I'm not saying that any of them are bad because they do work for a lot of folks. Might not work for everybody, might not work for everybody in a given situation. So you need to also give yourself a little bit of grace and allow
Yeah.
yourself to be a human being.
I mean, that's the bottom line, really, is when you're working with somebody who's autistic or has ADHD, it's you gotta give them space because you can't use what you've learned from your own parents to put onto you to put onto your child because from what I've learned from other people is all that's going to lead to is more problems.
Right, 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 right. Yeah. And even like for example, like with my son. So my son has been doing ABA
Yeah.
most of his life. Now I don't poo-poo ABA at all. I think ABA is good. I think though it depends like everything
Mhm.
on who he's working with, right?
Yeah.
He has had some excellent ABA therapists who get a lot out of him, and he's had some that weren't great. And you know what? Here's the thing with my son. And teachers have said this over the years, and even where he's going to school right now, they've said it. We think he knows more than he's letting on. Why? Because we know our kid. We know that if you're going to ask him to do the same task repeatedly just because you need to get that 3 out of 5 or whatever your goal is, at some point he's just gonna be like, dude, I'm not doing this. This is boring. Like I
Yeah.
don't like this. And so he's just gonna shut down and be like, yeah. And it's like, well, how come he's not responding? Well, he's not responding because he doesn't want to do it. Now, again, that doesn't mean you let him off the hook on everything, right?
Yeah.
Because you still need to have structure and goals, but you have to be flexible and you have to be willing to work with the child and say, okay, you know what is he or she actually responding to here? And you know what? Maybe it's the environment, maybe it's the therapist, maybe it's the client. I mean, it can be any number of things, but that's where I also say as a former educator, the biggest piece of advice that I give to anybody in the teaching world, the best thing you can do, or therapy for that matter, is just observe. Just watch. Data collection is great, but you also need to see if the data you're getting matches what you're seeing,
Yeah.
right? And if you can just step out, be objective, look at what's happening, okay, you know what? Maybe they're telling me something here. So, for me, it's always plugging into like my child, or the child or adult you're working with and saying, where are they at? What do they want to do? What do they like, right? We have to always remember to have that choice available.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you said ABA depends on the person. And I believe a lot of the backlash on it is because people are viewing it from what they know from the past. ABA hit all I knew when I first started my podcast about ABA was from what I've read. But I've talked with so many ABA specialists that they're like, "Oh my God, it's a whole new world now." They're training people better. You have a lot better therapists out there who know how to treat the kid, whose families love to have. It's either you'll have therapists that'll either come to the house and work with the kid, or you'll have therapists where you have to bring the kid to them. And either way, they're like, it depends on the therapist and what company you go with and their therapists.
Yeah, and there's no question about it. And one of the frustrating things for me, and this, I'll just share this story quick. In my last role as a special ed teacher in Chicago, I worked with a young man who mom was taking him to a pretty well established ABA clinic in the city, and apparently the guy who ran it was some form of ABA guru, let's just call it that. And he would have one of the therapists, working under him, would come to the school at times, and because we didn't have, an ABA therapist at the school, but I was familiar, and so I worked with that therapist to, help create programs, and we included, some activities and goals and things. But what was interesting was when we had a conference, okay, and one of the things that I stressed, because this young man was autistic and nonverbal, very much like my own son. And what I expressed was this young man had touch chat on his iPad. Okay. Um, mom and dad were good people, good parents, but they didn't understand it. They didn't know how to use it. And even though the speech therapist, the private speech therapist, had spent a lot of time working with the young man on it, mom and dad didn't know it, didn't get it, didn't reinforce it at home or anywhere else, as much as I tried to at school. Now, what I communicated to and during this conference we had, the parent, the principal, the ABA guy, and I said, listen, I said, I realize that maybe, him using the device is not something that you're as comfortable with, or maybe you would just prefer that he talks. But here's the thing. First of all, if he needs to communicate a need very strongly, or God forbid, he's out somewhere, let's say on a field trip somewhere, and he gets lost and he has to tell someone who he is, where he lives, who to call, he can very much learn that through the device. And obviously we want him to communicate, verbally, but if he's not there yet, we need a way for him to engage with his world. And oh, by the way, developmentally, he's still developing pathways for language,
Hmm.
right? He's still applying that. It's just using the device as the medium. And the ABA guru was basically like, well, we've done, case studies, or, we've looked at data, and the kids with these devices, they just guess, they just point to anything. So really the solution is ABA. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, the solution is ABA for you, but here's the thing. I'm concerned about this young man being safe and having a voice so that he can communicate. So I'm not saying don't do ABA, but please also don't tell me that ABA is the be all end all answer,
No,
because
it's not.
right, because and you know what, because nothing is, right. You find something that works, and to whatever degree, percentage, etc., great. But at the same time, how is this young man going to engage in his world, right?
I mean, one of the greatest stories I have was I had this guest on, and he is, forgot what his position was, but he works with the University of Virginia Commonwealth, and they have a program where if you want to be somebody who works with those who are disabled, who have an intellectual disability, one of the things they do is you have to go and visit the family before you do anything, just to see what it is like hands-on. And I think that's a lot of the biggest issue is you have a lot of people out there who don't know what it's like to be on the other end of the spectrum, to be autistic, to be nonverbal, to have ADHD and autism. And you don't know what the family goes through. All you know is one side of it. And that's why they're doing what they do, is because they're giving them a full eye view of what it's like to live with this family.
Right. And that's where I really stress communicating and sharing from the parent point of view, certainly for myself and for a lot of the people that I know are in this world. But I would say this to any educator, any therapist, whoever you are and however you're engaging with families like us. you have to be able to relate on a level that allows you some empathy for the experience that we're going through. And again, I've sat on both sides of the IEP table. It's
Mhm.
easy for teachers to judge a family. Well, you guys aren't doing enough, and I'm like, do you want to come hang out at the house tonight and see what's going on? Because again, for families like ours, and in my son's case. He never had any extreme aggression, but he did have some bits and bouts with aggressive behaviors that absolutely necessitated his need to have a placement out of state. We didn't just send him there for no reason. There was stuff. So it's really having that experience. But one other thing too, and this is also a piece of advice I always give is like in the case of my son and his mom. One thing we would always do was we would go to the main. So my son was in a life skills classroom. So it was a special ed room, but again, the focus is life skills again because of the nature of his autism and
Mhm.
communication. But so he would spend time in the mainstream classroom, mostly for specials or certain activities, events, whatever. But his mom and I would go and speak to that mainstream classroom, and we would talk about it. And we would tell the kids, hey, listen, this is Chris, and show a little video. And hey, Chris likes doing all this other stuff. He likes horseback riding and swimming and camping and all these things. How many of you like this? Great. Now you know what? Chris is a little different. Chris also doesn't communicate the same way that you do. But here's ways you can develop a relationship with him. Here's ways that you can talk to him. Here's ways you can be a friend. We did that at his mainstream classroom in the school. We also did it at a Sunday school classroom at the church. We even had some of the staff from the school actually come to the church as well and speak. So what does that do? First of all, it allows for students of, whether they're really young or even if they're a little bit older, because, you know, eh, just because someone is, reached a certain age doesn't mean they necessarily have a level of empathy, right? So, as much as possible, share with those kids, hey, you know what? This is who he is, or this is who she is. And these are ways that you can connect. So it humanizes your child in that environment, for them to be more accepted, but it also develops great relationships
Mhm.
with school staff or your church or whatever organization you're a part of. And then it also helps that bonding, so that when you come to those IEP meetings or you come to those environments, and those tables that are usually pretty high stress,
Oh
you've
yeah.
got a good relationship to work from. It's not, I
Mhm.
haven't seen you all year and now I'm ready to fight you. It's, you know what?
Yeah.
We're on the same team because we've always been, right? How much easier does that, make our world?
I mean, you said the magic thing is IEP, and I've talked to countless people, and they're like, you don't realize how clueless these parents are when they walk into a meeting because they get thrown all these initials and everything, and their heads just start spinning, and they don't know from jack of what their child's needs are, and they just they say okay, whatever, whatever, and they just agree with whatever, and they just don't follow up, and then that's why a lot of kids fall through the gaps.
Right. And this is also where like I would always remind school staff to know, look, you have to understand that parents are doing the best they can, depending on the nature of the disability, depending on the severity, if there are other medical issues, if it's a developmental thing, whatever, like you have no idea what these parents are going through. So you have to logically kind of support them and help them along the way. Now to be fair, again, being on both sides, I know how overworked and overwhelmed teachers are.
Hmm.
Teaching is a ridiculously hard job, especially today because of the amount of reporting and data entry and all of those things. And I'm not saying it doesn't have value, but the fact is that teachers are also on the other end exhausted, and they are, for the most part, they are trying their best. Are there some bad teachers? Sure, just like in any walk of life.
Yeah.
And I've come across a few. I'm like, I don't quite like how you said that, but okay, fine. But again, we always want to give the benefit of the doubt and say, you know what? I know you're working very hard. I get it. I've been in the classroom, or I'm in the classroom. I understand it. Mom understands it. We get it. that doesn't mean we still can't hold everybody to a high standard, but you know what? Boy, it makes everything easier when this isn't the first time we're meeting, or we've just been yelling at each other through email or text or phone
Yeah.
call or whatever kind of a thing. Relationship is key because at the end of the day, if the focus is your child, you know what? I don't necessarily have to like you. I just have to know if you have their best interests in mind, great, we can figure out a way to work together.
Now, let's go back to your writings and everything. What topic or message do you find yourself returning to again and again in your writing and speaking?
That's a great question. If you're asking me what I keep coming back to, so I guess here's how I'll answer that question. And my book, my memoir that's coming out, I think encapsulates this idea perfectly. So when people ask me what's your advice, right? Give us, if you had to give anybody advice that's kind of in this world, what would you say? And using my former teacher brain, I give a number one little a and a number one little b. Now, for me, my number one little a is my faith, right? Um, as a Christian, that is the foundation of who I am and what I believe. I am nothing without that faith. That faith has gotten me through more valleys and more challenges than I can actually count. And my book is really a reflection of that. It is something, even if you're not a Christian or not a person of faith, I think you will still resonate with it as a parent of disability. However, for me, I keep coming back to the importance of having that strong foundation. But that one B, as I've been mentioning here in our time here, is community. You cannot do this alone. If you're not a spiritual person or religious person, okay, fine. But you know what? You cannot do this alone. You need people. And so what I keep kind of coming back to is, kind of what, when you are rock bottom, face on the floor, lost everything, your mind's gone, what are you kind of coming back to? What is that foundation for you? For some people it is just their community, and that's fine. For some it is faith. For me, it's both. I think for a lot of people it's both or similar. But this is where I say that, you know, we kind of throw words like faith around and belief and all of these things. And I know that some people can kind of poo-poo it because they're like, well, that doesn't really mean anything or do anything for me. And here's what I say to that. I say, faith is one of these things where it's easy to have faith when the worst thing that happens to you is you spill your coffee on the way to work, or someone cuts you off, or screams at you on the road or something. Okay, not the way I wanted to start my day. It's tough when your life is in chaos. We're just like the guy that I was, in that sitting in that car in that parking lot story, which, oh, by the way, it's probably a good segue to tell the second part of that story,
Mm.
because I sat in that car in that parking lot all the way back. That was 2012, when I had no community, no resources, nothing. 7 years later, in November of 2019, it was actually Black Friday, believe it or not, can't make this up. I had just gotten handed divorce papers from my son's mom. Out of the blue, no warning. We're not fighting. We're not in counseling. Just don't love you anymore. Here you go.
Yeah.
What do I do? I'm like, I have to get out of the house and clear my head. I get in the car. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm going to do. I drive to the nearest big box store kind of parking lot, retail area, and I'm just sitting in the parking lot, back in the parking lot, right? This time I had a million people to call. And in fact, what's funny is the first guy I called was a guy I knew who was a special needs attorney,
Mhm.
also a father of disability, and also divorced. I'm like, wow, that's, I got a trifecta right there. So, he was the first guy I called. And he gave me some great advice and steered me to an attorney that I wound up using in the divorce, who was great. But I had all special needs dads I could call. I had, people from church. I had, pastors. I had counselors. I had all of these people who could speak to me from a slightly different perspective in terms of what I needed. That was there when I needed it the most. And so for me, for my writing, the message there is, do not do this alone. Please, whatever you do, don't do it alone. Get someone who understands you. Get someone who understands your journey. No one's ever going to understand perfectly. That's okay.
Mhm.
Like I have a friend that I met through some of my work with dad organizations. We became friends several years ago. We'll literally text each other all the time. And sometimes those texts are, Man, this just made me nuts today. Great. What's going on? Lay it on me, and it could be about anything. But that's just what it is. Do you have a person you could reach out to who you're like, man, I'm struggling today? Cool. Tell me about it. Do you have at least one of those? And if you don't have at least one, get yourself at least one. One will do. One's a start, but don't do it alone because
I
we're
mean,
not meant to and we shouldn't.
that is such an important thing. And that's one of the big things why I do my podcast is I want people to know you're not alone in this world. You're not the only parent. You're not the only person who's autistic. There are millions out there doing the same thing you are, wondering the same thing you're thinking. Am I alone out there? Do I have the help I need?
Right, exactly. And that's also where too, you know, so one thing that I also talk about when I speak about community is, social media is great, the internet is great. There are a million Facebook groups you can get connected with. There are other virtual groups, there are virtual support groups, even some that I'm connected to, even for special needs dads. That's all great, but also don't neglect real intentional relationships where you can actually connect with someone in person or connect with somebody offline, whether that's a phone call or, however else you want to communicate, because groups are fine, virtual support is fine. And I'm glad that it's there to the degree it is, quite honestly. However, you also want to make sure that, if you're having a really rough day, just like, the experience I just shared getting hit with divorce papers. Do you have
Mhm.
someone who literally can just, hey, you know what, let me meet you in 20 minutes for a coffee or a beer or whatever, Do you have that? Right. And again, not saying that the people in the virtual world don't matter, but it's important to have those people just kind of in your back pocket right there for you too.
Now, why do you think that the theme resonates so deeply with dads?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Why do you think that the theme resonates so deeply with dads?
Because I think that guys, and when I spoke about, processing emotions and feelings differently, um, men are fixers, but men are also social. Now, here's the thing. Men are different socially than women. So I always tell this joke. I say, you know what? You put a bunch of guys together in a room that don't know each other. They might all be dads with disability. They'll stare at each other and not say two words. You put a bunch of moms in a room, put them in a table, stick a bottle of wine in the middle. By the end of the night, they're all best friends, right? So the idea here is that it's something that men need, but how is it being presented? How are you engaging, right? And that's the thing for guys, is that it's tricky because for women, it's just way more natural in terms of building relationships, even with total strangers. I never met you. Oh, but 3 hours later, man, we're planning vacations and stuff. Okay. And I'm not saying it's that way in every situation, but for the most part, men, I think also too naturally are going to be way more comfortable around guys that they know. Right. And I've seen this play out in a lot of environments. It's very hard for a guy to just show up to something cold. A lot of times with the dad groups that I would run, you hear from, well, I showed up because, mom told me to come here. My wife kicked me out the door, and you go to this thing and see what's going on. Okay. However you get there is fine. But that's kind of the thing, is that men have a much harder time of communicating their feelings, especially when it's about their child with a disability, because of the level of grief and guilt and
Mm.
shame that they carry. And both parents carry it, but men process it differently, and they are not interested in sharing anything about that. It's funny. I actually do a couple of different dad support groups in person locally, but in one of the groups, it's really not structured in that. It's a bunch of guys that just get together. There's no agenda. We don't expect guys to share. We don't expect anybody to, like, if you don't want to talk about things, that's fine. But guys are there. And if guys feel like sharing, they can share. And if not, that's okay too. And sometimes that's all guys need. Sometimes guys just want to be around guys that, okay, you kind of get what I'm going through if I need to share something. Or if not, let me just be a guy. And that's the other side of it as well. Men also just need men who remind them, you know what, yes, you have a child with a disability, but you know what, you're still a dad, you're still a husband, you're still a guy like us. It's cool. You can, and just the normalcy also too that things, groups like that, communities like that can present, because that's the other thing we struggle with too is normalcy. It's like we're not the ones who just send our kids off to a play date, no big deal, or our kids go to the playground and we can go be doing something else, or my kid is independent enough to do this. For the most part, we're always with our kids and always on top of them, at least one of the parents. So, how great is it to just be around a bunch of guys where you can just bring kind of bring all those walls down and just say, you know what, I'm just here and I'm just, happy to be with guys who at least get me and are willing to listen to me if necessary.
That's such a true thing. I mean, guys are fixers, and it's like the old cliche: a man won't ask for directions where a woman would.
Yeah, yeah, and that is and that also goes back to the whole communication thing. It's, I think the core of that little analogy is the man has such a hard time admitting that he doesn't know where he's at.
Yeah.
It's that shame of I can't ask this guy for directions, man, because he's, whatever, and as opposed to, hey, sorry, can you help me? And again, that's really the root of it. It comes back down to a man being transparent enough,
Hmm.
comfortable enough, and really just vulnerable enough to be able to say, hey, you know what? I need some help. Can you direct me, listen to me? Maybe I don't know what I need, but I need something. Am I willing to put my guard down enough for that?
Now, you've done interviews across different formats, blogs, podcasts, in-person events. Which format brings out the most honest conversations?
I will tell you that I have definitely taken to the podcast world in the last couple of years. I've done a bunch of them. I started doing them several years ago, but I've definitely done a lot more. And what I will tell you is it's funny. I used to do a lot more blog writing, and then I kind of paused because I was working on some of this book stuff. But I definitely engaged in the podcast world and got involved with a lot of podcasting networks and communities and that type of thing. And I really enjoy this format because, again, I love things being conversational. I love being able to engage with different hosts who have some different perspectives as well. And it's always a little bit fresh and different. I can tell you that I don't even know how many podcasts I've done at this point. It's easily over 50, probably closer to 75. But even though they are, for the most part, all disability related, they are all unique and a little bit different. Some focus really specifically on fatherhood. Some focus more on autism. Some focus more on the education piece or the marriage piece. And usually it's a little bit of a mix, but sometimes there's more of a focus on one than the other, and that's great. Because here's the thing: I know that for whoever's listening, they may not be as interested in certain aspects, but maybe there are some that were like, oh, that's absolutely what I needed. And that's great. And you know what? For me, I feel like there's enough of that material out there where if you look for it, or based on the nature of the podcast or kind of the platform or the format, I'll probably be speaking more to a particular topic, and maybe that's what you engage with. So, for me, this has been, kind of really a fun and enjoyable way to get the message across.
Now, is there a question someone asked you that stuck with you?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was on a podcast last year, and we got to the end of the interview, and the guy asked me, "So, do you like spam?" And I'm like, now, because apparently this was his shtick, right? I mean, it was an on the level. It was actually a disability focused podcast, but that was just kind of his little shtick at the end. And I forget his connection to spam, if he would lived in the hometown where it was made, or I don't know. But he asked me about my experience with it, and I shared I enjoy spam. I don't eat it that often, but
Oh,
I like it when I do.
yeah.
Okay, and so I thought that was kind of funny. But I don't know if there was one question that really stood out, but for me, if someone is really going to get down into Because I think with a lot of these conversations, we can keep it surface level. We can kind of talk about, okay, you were a parent and a teacher, and what was it like for your son in school? But, really talking about just those really difficult points in life, where again, I felt alone, I felt abandoned, I felt rejected. Um, really kind of walking through those emotions because again, even if you're a parent of disability in a great marriage, you've still had those moments in your marriage. Or if you're a single parent or remarried, you've definitely had those moments. Or, if, leave the marriage piece out of it. Think about just the relationship with your child. You know, when you were grieving a diagnosis or when you were grieving a particular medical event, let's say, or whatever it was, it really kind of getting into the nitty gritty of that. I love when I can share on that level for sure.
Now, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges dads of special needs children face that often go unspoken?
I think a lot of it is what I've already kind of touched on. Really, again, it's just the shame and the guilt, right? And I guess here's a little wrinkle that I'll add to it. So, for example, a lot of dads, especially when it's a male child with a disability, they struggle because they had dreams for that boy, for that male child. They were going to take him hunting or fishing or travel baseball or whatever your thing is, you were going to do it with your kid, and now all of a sudden you can't, or it looks remarkably different. And so what I always emphasize is, look, I said, you're still that child's parent, you're still that child's father. You got to find a way to connect on some level. So like in my son's case, for example, my son is not anywhere near, he doesn't have the motor skills to play organized sports. He actually does like buddy baseball where he's going to school right now, and it's kind of cool, but obviously he still needs someone to help him with the bat and okay, now run to the base and all this kind of thing. But he likes watching sports on TV, and it's something that we can share. He likes football, basketball, if it's high action and movement and motion, and it's something that, I don't know that he necessarily understands the game, but he just likes seeing the players play. So it's something we enjoy doing. But like when he was little, we used to have like a basketball hoop in the driveway. And, he doesn't even have the motor strength to be able to push the ball into the basket, right? He can pass the ball, he can bounce it around, but he really can't make a shot. But you know what? I would shoot the ball, whether I missed it or not, he'd still be laughing and cheering because he just thought it was so awesome. The ball went in the air and clanged on something, right? Or like if we, go to a gym or like a church, if they have a gym kind of a thing and we, pass the ball around. If dad's shooting, great. He likes seeing me do that because it's a way for him to be invested. And that's what I say is find that way, whatever your thing is, if it's a female child, if it's a girl, okay, so what are some things that maybe you can also share? Maybe it is sports, maybe it's something else, whatever. But the fact is that you still have to somehow find a way to make that bridge in order to maintain the relationship and grow the relationship with your child. Because at the end of the day, those are still going to be very, very unique experiences, memories, and things that you will take with you. So, did it look the same with my son as it did for a lot of my other friends' kids? No. But I'll tell you, we still had a lot of fun. We did a lot of cool things. And he and I still enjoy doing a lot of the same stuff, even if it's as simple as taking a little walk or a hike outside. That is still bonding time for us.
Now, how can communities or support systems better address those hidden struggles?
Well, I think there definitely needs to be more of a focus on support for parents and families. It's interesting. There are, a ton of great disability organizations out there, and a lot of them have a family focus. But what we really need, I think, are more opportunities for parents to connect, for moms and dads separately to connect, and for real honest support groups where, parents can just kind of just let it all out kind of a thing. There's tons of resources in terms of books and videos and podcasts and things you can listen to. But if you're looking to really just again foster connection and relationship and community, that's what I think we need to be seeing more of. And again, not that it doesn't exist, but I do think we need more of it. And I think that we need to really acknowledge how difficult this is. Really, it's not just a little bit of a challenge, it's a lot of a challenge. And all of our challenges are different, and they look different because they are different. But that's also where I think we need to offer those spaces as much as possible for families to connect, share, develop relationships and community, but also have a place where they feel like, you know what, I have no one else to share this with, and it is just, it's just the craziest time or the craziest thing that we've had happen to us. I need somewhere to share it that I feel safe and I feel welcomed.
All right. And when you mentor dads one-on-one in your local community, what does the process look like?
So it can look a variety of ways. Sometimes it can be as simple as me just meeting a dad in person for a sit down, and just kind of seeing what his needs are. Sometimes it involves, a support group. So I'm involved with a couple of support groups locally in the Chicago area. If you're in the Chicago area, I encourage you to reach out to me because I can help you connect with those. And again, sometimes those are as simple as a bunch of guys getting together at a restaurant and hanging out. Sometimes it's a little bit more focused. I actually do like to do things like have group speakers come out and speak to a group of dads kind of thing. I've certainly done that a lot of times over the years, and that's also been very beneficial. Sometimes it's also a matter of seeing what the dad really needs and would he benefit from, or is he open to being part of a larger community? So one organization that I always love to plug in these interviews is Special Fathers Network. So Special Fathers Network is a national organization based in Chicago. Most of the resources are online and virtual. So for example, if you like the idea of a group, you could certainly come to like an in-person group like what I do, or I recommend you join either an in-person group through that organization, but they also meet virtually. And there are virtual groups that meet of local guys, but also guys from around the country. So depending on what you're comfortable with, you have that option. But let's say you don't want a group, at least you're not ready for it yet, whatever, you can get connected with one dad. They have a great mentoring program where you can get connected one-on-one with a dad,
Mhm.
maybe in your community, same age as your child, disability, whatever. But there's a matching process. You get matched up with a mentor dad, and then
Hmm.
you've got that one guy. So it really depends on kind of what someone is ready for. If it's just a matter of, I just need somebody to talk to, great, when can you meet? And even if it's not me, let me find someone for you. Even if you're not in my area, I can probably connect you. And if you're ready for something a little more structured or a bigger group thing, we can do that. We can do that in person. We can connect you with somebody in your area. You can do it online if that's all you need. But really, it's a matter of being willing to take the step and say, this is what I think I'm ready for, and whatever that is fine. It's more of the issue of taking the step, being ready and willing to take that step to engage in this experience of community.
Now, is there something you always make sure you say during the first meeting?
Not necessarily, I think the best approach is just to listen. I want to listen to, kind of what's going on for them, their mind, heart, etc. Where are you at in terms of kind of your walk and your journey with your child? What is it that you're needing? And then I like to, and going back to that point I made at the beginning about being a Swiss Army knife, I may not have all the answers for you, but I probably know someone that does. So at the very least, I can point you in a direction. So, I know I've met with, I got referred to a family probably a couple months ago, and it was through a connection, and they were, and it was a couple. It was a mom and a dad, and they had a child who was, probably about the same age as my son, so almost an adult, and they were just, kind of frustrated because they felt like they were on an island. They didn't know what they were going to do in terms of their child now becoming an adult, and where was she going to live, and where was she going to go to school, and what about this, and so it was a matter of, okay, tell me what your concerns are. Tell me where you're at. What questions do you have? What's something that you think you're really needing right now? And so then I could kind of tailor it and taper it, to really kind of focus on, okay, these are things that I think, you might want to connect with, people, organizations, et cetera, kind of thing. But I think it's really just about hearing where folks are at. And again, for a lot of folks who maybe have never had an opportunity or an experience like this, sometimes it's like, well, how much time do you got? I'll tell you everything. I'm like, well, that's fine too. But as much as I can identify things that I can help you with, then, that's really what I try to go for.
I mean, that's one of the big things you said. Is a lot of folks when they find out their child is special needs, autistic or ADHD, all of a sudden they feel like they're on an island. They don't know where to reach out to, and it's so important that there are people that they can to or find out where they can reach out to.
Right, exactly. And that's where I'm a big proponent of, as much as I can throw at a person, take it, let's just kind of see what sticks. You don't have to do all of it. You don't have to be a part of all of it. But, find the things that are, that connect with you kind of thing. And again, that is one of the interesting struggles is that most special needs parents and families usually get their best advice or support or suggestions from other families. That's just how it is. That's just how it's always been. And that's great. But usually what I have found is, there are lots of things I know about, and I know that I don't know everything that's out there. But I'm often caught off guard by like, hey, have you heard about this or do you know about this? And some people are like, I've never heard of that. And of course, in my head, I'm like, how could you've never heard of it? And it's like, well, a lot of families, again, are really just living day to day. They are on an island in a lot of cases. And, they're just not aware of what's out there, right? So as much as I can give them, great. Let's feed you that, whatever you're ready for, no problem. But let's at least give you as much information as we can.
Now, a lot of dads, they feel they need to stay strong. How do you relay it to them that vulnerability is also strength?
It's a good question. I just keep kind of reflecting back on my story and experience. And, here's the thing. If I if I could never admit that I was struggling, I was
Hmm.
never going to get help, right? No one's, and again, especially looking at the way men operate and things, if I'm not going to speak up and say, you know what, I'm going through a tough time. Okay, well, we're not going to guess about that. Now, again, some guys might, some people might, based on the situation. But, I really would emphasize the fact that as much as you're willing and ready to share, that can benefit you because then it allows other people or guys, dads, to be able to respond and say, "Oh yeah, you know what? If you're struggling with that, you know what? I've got something for you, or why don't you talk to me about this, or whatever it is." We have to be willing to open up because otherwise that help is not going to come, right? If we're sitting around saying, woe is me, and man, I wish I had help. But I'm not doing nothing about it because, whatever, I'm not willing to, share with anybody or put myself out there or, admit to this or that. That's not going to help anybody, specifically you, right? So you want to be able to at least be open enough. And again, I'm not suggesting, you don't have to go on a podcast like this or write a book or to tell your whole life story, but at least be willing to share enough with somebody so they know what it is you're needing, or maybe if they can, or how they can help you. The strength and the vulnerability then comes from the more open you are, the more people who might also be in a similar place want to engage because finally they're like, oh, cool, someone that's actually willing to share too about some of this stuff. And the more relationships you build and the more resources you gain. And like in my case, for example, because I was willing to be as vulnerable and transparent with my own story, not only was I able to help other people, again, to my point earlier, I was able to gain resources for myself. And that has also made all the difference for me and my son too.
Do you remember a moment when you learned that lesson yourself?
It probably definitely was that first parking lot story where I learned, and again, here was the hard part about that. I was willing to be vulnerable then, and I still wasn't getting the response that I needed. But that's also I think a good lesson too in that, sometimes, if you share the first time with someone, oh, okay, well, you know what, maybe it's not a match or a fit, or maybe you just didn't find the right person or group yet. That's okay. It didn't stop me from being vulnerable, right? And then when I was able to connect with the right guys in the right groups in the right community, then of course that made all the difference. Um, but it very much can be a work in progress, and it can be something that, sometimes doesn't work, the first time. I mean, even like the dad support groups that I started years ago, when I first started them, I really wasn't getting a good response at all, and I had to take a break from it, and then I had to restart it. When I restarted it, I did it with another guy, and we had a little bit more of a community we could kind of pull from by then. So we were able to get it off the ground. But again, it is also a lot of trial and error. And sometimes you don't always get the right fit in the beginning, but that's also where you want to keep trying at it.
Now, can you share a memorable story from your mentorship work, something that reaffirmed the importance of what you do?
Great question. Um, I think about so I mentioned speaking to some parents recently. There was another family that I worked with, and again, this was probably again also within the last couple months. But this was a family who they were older parents. Their son is in their 30s,
Mm,
and they're a family who, for the most part, I think, because their son was pretty high functioning, he's definitely on the spectrum, but pretty high functioning. He showed all of the aptitude to be able to navigate life independently, but he just never could. And there's some other mental health issues there, and I'm not clear on all of them. But when it was actually friends of mine actually that do work in the disability world that said, we think you would be a great person to bring in to help speak to them. And we had a Zoom call, we had a virtual call. And again, here are these older parents, they're in their 70s, I think. They physically cannot, really keep up with their child. They obviously need support for him. And not that I think he was aggressive, but I guess he was prone to fits of anger or being upset kind of thing. He was still living at home. I guess he had tried some independent, options, didn't work. And so really it was a question of, I'm seeing folks who right now should be just kind of focusing on retirement, focusing on getting ready kind of for those later stages of life, looking at ways that they're going to get support, right? Because here's the thing, and this is the thing that I always share about a huge fear that I have. Huge fear that I have is, is my child going to have the right care that he needs when somebody has to take care of me and I just can't step in anymore, right? So I'm seeing this couple, I'm seeing this family, and I'm saying to myself, yeah, you know what? Very soon you're going to need people taking care of you probably on some level. Um, so what does that mean for your child, right? So
mm,
that's where I was able, and they were also a family who I think love their child very much, but they really, I think, just kind of thought things would figure themselves out. And sometimes for families that can be a very typical thing too. So we were able to give them some resources, connect them with some folks. I made some advice and suggestions, but these are folks that my friends had talked to me about for a while. And when I met them, I finally kind of understood that these were folks who had every intention of supporting their child, but thought that, he would just kind of figure it out eventually. And unfortunately, again, because of, developmentally his needs and also some mental health things, he needed more than what they could give them. I think they finally just got to a point where they realized that they weren't enough, which is okay. We want to be able to admit that, and especially when we're in those later stages of life. So that really meant a lot to me in terms of,
mhm,
helping a family that I could just tell meeting with them,
mhm,
the level of emotion and fear and anxiety that they had over the situation. So, as much as I could help them, I know I was, really grateful for that.
Now, how did the experience influence the way you show up for other dads?
Well, I think it's pretty similar. I think that in terms of again, going back to that idea of listening, but also of, really putting myself into that other person's shoes, right? Because like when I spoke with, that family I just mentioned, I could see myself in their shoes. I could see with their son's situation how I might respond similarly, or even with my own son.
Mhm.
I could, feel that anxiety and fear and concern about, hey,
Mhm.
this is something that, is going to be a problem very soon, kind of a thing. So, I think it prepares me to say, you know what, as much as you can connect with that other person and kind of walk in their shoes a little bit and also show that empathy, the empathy piece is huge. Then that allows you to really, kind of hone in because again, it's really easy, and not that I've experienced a lot of this, but it can be easy to be judgy in some situations. It's like, how could you not know about this, or why haven't you tried this? And it's like, you know what? We're all doing the best we can, right?
Yeah.
So let's not assume that everybody knows it, because again, I don't know everything either. But as much as I can share and help that person along, then that's the goal.
Now, what role has community played in your own journey as a special needs parent?
Well, again, going back to just having the resources available, um, just having those connections, and here's the thing. I speak to the benefits of community in terms of having resources and being connected to organizations that I might work with, or something that I became connected with through a friend or a networking or whatever. But really it's also again those friendships, right? Legitimate friendships I've made with dads, parents, etc., that I never would have had. I tell this story. Um, this was a few years ago, when I was before I was remarried. So I have a good friend who's a dad of disability. He has two adult sons who are higher functioning autistic. And one of the sons who knew me and knew my son, in the town we lived in the North Chicago suburbs, it was like a fall season, and the town specifically did this big like fall fest, like a pumpkin fest kind of a thing. And the whole town was decorated, and they had all these activities and different stuff and food and things. And they were planning on going, and it was actually my friend's son who said, "Hey, can we see John and Chris?" Because again, we lived in the town, but also, it was him saying, "Yeah, I'd like to see them." So even beyond my friend saying it, his son said it. And how awesome is that when you can have not only those people who want to see you and your child, regardless of how you show up, but their own kids saying, "Yes, I would like to be with them." I mean, that is such an amazing thing when you can have relationships on that level with the people you engage with.
Now, was it hard for you to accept help at first?
I would say it was a little bit. It was a little bit, because again, I even had some of that guilt and shame too going on. I eventually kind of moved past it.
Mhm.
But a lot of it, again, even going back to that story about that men's group at the church where they were just kind of checked out. It takes a lot to really admit, man, I'm struggling, or I feel
Mhm.
defeated, or I'm being punched in the face by life, kind of a thing. It's not easy. It's not easy to admit that. But luckily, I was able to, I was able to say again, kind of going back to my point a few minutes ago, I put it out on the table for one group of guys and I got no response. Okay, you know what? Let me be willing to try it again. But here's the thing. I think that I was also willing to try it as much as I did, as many times as I did, because I also was in a season of life where I could just feel being pressured on all sides and just being squeezed by life. And it was to the point where I said, like, I need help. I need help. And you know what? I'm going to try as many different venues until I finally find the right one. And ultimately for me, I did find, I did find that again on a number of levels. But if I wasn't squeezed to the degree I was, would I have been willing to do it as much as I did? Maybe not, at least not right away. So I think that that definitely made an impact. Hey Reed, I don't mean to interrupt, but I see we're at 6:15 and I
Yeah.
actually need to get off the call. So I don't know how much longer you want to go.
Well, we can
Um,
we can we can end up here.
okay.
So I can go with let's end it with where can people find out more about you online and how can they reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can just punch my name into the Google machine, as I like to famously say, you'll find a bunch of my content. Now, I do have a website. It's johnfella.com, so it's just my name.com. I will tell you, I'm in the process of kind of rehashing my website, so it will be getting some updates here pretty soon. A lot of the content on there is not always the freshest, so if you put me into a Google search, you'll always find the freshest stuff as far as podcast writing, etc. I do have a couple of Facebook pages. You connect with me. You can connect with me on my regular Facebook page, which is just John Fellow, or I have a blog page, John Special Needs blog, John Special Needs blog on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram, John underscore Fella underscore one. I'm on LinkedIn, X, also John Fellow. Plug me into any of those other socials, and you'll find me there.
And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Reed Miles, and that was John Fella. And remember, you're never alone. See you in the next one. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Reed. Appreciate it. This was
Not a
awesome.
problem.